I'm so happy to be here with all of you, and very excited to be supporting my dear friend Justine Cowan, and so happy to meet Christina as well. It's just a wonderful event for me, so thank you for allowing me this little personal touch to kick off the evening. So I have known Justine for over 20 years. We met in our early 30s when we were both young lawyers in Atlanta, newly in charge of different public interest environmental law organizations. That was, as they say, the beginning of a beautiful friendship that has seen us work closely together, fight injustice together, celebrate together, get angry together, and sometimes at each other, forgive each other, laugh and cry together, show up for and take care of each other, live together, celebrate together, mourn together, and grow into the people and professionals that we are today. She played the fiddle at my wedding and flew to be with me without me even asking when my father died. And I attended her small wedding to the wonderful Patrick and drove to Tennessee to be with her when each of her parents died. I am proud to call her one of my oldest and best friends. Throughout our friendship, I heard a lot about her mother. The conversations were mostly Justine being angry or frustrated or outraged at something her mother had done or said. I knew only bits and pieces of her childhood, but I did know that there was no love lost between the two of them, and that Justine had spent much of her adult life building a protective wall between her and her mother so that her mother could not hurt her anymore. Several years ago, when first her mother and then a year later her father died, I thought for sure I'd heard the last of Justine's childhood, her mother, and that tangled and painful relationship. So you can imagine my surprise when I visited her in 2017 in Orlando, and she told me that she had started researching and writing a book about her mother. I could not begin to understand why. But then she explained the research she had begun to do, the narrative her mother had written, and what she was finding out about foundling hospitals. She showed me the beginning of what she had written, and I was in tears by the end of the first page. It was clear to me then that this would be no ordinary story. And it is not. I also wondered how Justine could hope to do anything more than self-publish this book. I mean, she was an environmental lawyer and not an author. What on earth did she know about writing and publishing a book? But as she has done her entire life, she figured out the path, she did the work, she made strategic choices, and has now achieved great success with her first novel. And I am proud to have been along for the ride, cheering from the sidelines the entire way. The Secret Life of Dorothy Soames is an editor's pick of the New York Times Book Review, has been recommended by the Saturday Evening Post, Amazon Book Review, Kirkus, Publishers Weekly, and many more. In England, it has been featured in the Mail on Sunday, the Daily Mirror, and the Spectator, called Extraordinary by the Telegraph, and selected as the best new book based on real life by Glamour magazine. It is, in short, a smashing success for any author, much less a first-time author. And Christina, this is where I get to express my deep gratitude to you. Early in this process, Justine attended one of your writing workshops, and you were an inspiration to her to keep working, keep writing, keep striving. So to you, I say thank you for lighting the path for my friend to realize this accomplishment and achieve her current success. Many of you will undoubtedly know Christina Baker Kline, a #1 New York Times bestselling author of 8 novels, including The Exiles, Orphan Train, and A Piece of the World. She is published in over 40 countries. Her novels have received the New England Prize for Fiction, the Maine Literary Award, and a Barnes & Noble Discover Award, among other prizes, and have been chosen by hundreds of communities, universities, and schools as One Book, One Read selections. Her essays, articles, and reviews have appeared in publications such as the New York Times and the New York Times Book Review, the Boston Globe, the San Francisco Chronicle, Lit Hub, Psychology Today, and Slate. And I want to make sure to mention that The Exiles, which was an instant New York Times bestseller, will be available in paperback in July. So thanks to you both for coming to Asheville, Thanks very much to Malaprops for hosting us, and thanks to those of you who have tuned in to listen. I'm pleased to now give you my friend and author, Justine Cowan, and Christina Baker Kline. Thank you.
Well, that was a wonderful introduction, Julie. Thank you so much. And what Julie was saying about Christina helping light the way is really true. It was, I mean, before I had even decided to write a book, I had, of course, read the book Orphan Train, and I had thought about how that story had resonated with me. And it was literally that book that made me think, well, maybe I can write a book about foundlings and my mother's journey. And I did. I traveled all the way to Kauai and and took a workshop of yours, and that's where it all began. And then Christina, you were the very first review that I got of my book.
And well, so, your editor, Sarah Nelson, is an old friend of mine, and I adore her. And I was sitting in her office one day in New York City, and because my editor is right down the hall, and she told me about, this and how excited she was. And it's such a beautiful book, and it's so incredibly, profoundly memorable. And the fact that it's memoir is really interesting, because you have been through the ringer, and we'll be talking about that in a minute. But just as a physical object, I wanted to point out that it is such a wonderful cover. And I wondered if you, maybe by way of introduction, we could think about, and by the way, thank you to Malaprops and to everyone here, Patricia and Julie and Stephanie, for being so incredibly welcoming. But I wanted to talk about the cover and what it means for you in terms of what the book is about. And maybe we could lead straight into a description of what the book is.
Sure. Well, I love the cover so much. And here I've got your book right here, another cover that I love. And, one thing I loved about it when it showed up, and because of the pandemic, of course, there's always going to be something, it actually got waylaid. And the shipment of my books did not show up in time for my publication. And so wonderful Sarah Nelson FedEx something so that I could actually just have one copy in my hand. And I love it because, it's you can feel the different textures on the book. And to me, that's really what's symbolic of the book, is that there's so many different moving pieces going on that really told not just my family's history, but the history of the Foundling Hospital, and that there's story within a story within a story. And that I was really it was like the layers of an onion, just kind of peeling them back. And really right up until publication, I was still finding out different layers of this extraordinary story. And I will also tell you that since publication, I have continued to find out more things.
I want to hear. Actually, I don't know. Can you talk about that, or is it a spoiler? I mean, at some point, I really would like to hear, because there's such an uncovering. Can we start at the beginning and talk about? So, for me, as I think about the book, your childhood, which was so difficult with your mother in some ways, is where it begins, because you were raised by a woman who, first of all, who was not quite as she seemed, and second, who clearly had some psychological problems from childhood. And so talk about your journey toward writing this book.
Well, there was a lot of times in my life, as I talk about in the book, where I didn't want to know the story of my mother's life. When I grew up, my mother was very proper British woman. She raised me to be a proper British lady. I had handwriting lessons and creative writing lessons and French lessons and equestrian lessons. I mean, you name it. And the handwriting lessons didn't pay off very well. And I also had to learn diction, and she wanted me to speak the Queen's English. You can see that didn't work out as she had planned. I have my nice American accent, but
you had to dress beautifully.
Yes, and so, but she was hiding a secret, and I knew that she was. She could be volatile at times. She could be sweet at other times. And then, it really started when I was 19 years old. I had never heard anything about my family. I didn't know anything about my grandparents or anything like that. And when I was 19 years old, I was called home from college by my father, who said that my mother had been driving to the hospital, even though she wasn't ill. And I didn't quite understand that and wouldn't understand that for many years to come. And I found her sitting alone in the dark in a scene that seemed like should be in Sunset Boulevard, where, the light's streaming in, she's in her white nightgown and she's writing a name over and over and over again: Dorothy Soames, Dorothy Soames, Dorothy Soames. And we never said those words to each other again in her lifetime. And not once, she never said those words again.
What was her name? Her chosen name?
And that was Dorothy Soames was her name from when she was 2 months old until she was, I don't want to give any spoilers, but a teenager. And so,
and I'm saying, what was the name that she had chosen for herself, or what was her?
Well, she was born as Eileen Weston.
Mm-hmm.
And then she was renamed because she was given up to, the full name is the Hospital for the Maintenance and Education of Exposed and Deserted Young Children, which was also called the Foundling Hospital. And I didn't know this. And did not discover this for many years after that.
And so what led you to write the book? So you had that experience with your mother, and then what else happened as you started to learn more?
Well, when my mother died, I was literally overcome with grief. I was exhausted. And it took me a very long time to recover from the grief after my mother died. But as Julie mentioned earlier, I spent most of my life really disliking my mother. And so it came as a huge shock that I was this distraught. And then a few years later, my husband and I went to London, where my mother was born, and wandering the streets, I just couldn't stop thinking about her. And, why was I thinking about a woman who had caused me so much pain? And when I went home, I decided that I was going to look into it. And I started Googling Dorothy Soames, and there was all sorts of things that I did. And then, I remember that my mother had actually written me a letter once saying that she was a foundling, and that wasn't until I was probably about 30 years old. And so I Googled foundling and London, and up popped the Foundling Hospital. And I reached out to an email to a complete stranger, and I said, I think my mother might have been Dorothy Soames. Do you know anything? And I heard back, and that's when the journey began.
So such an incredible journey. So you lived in, was it California?
At that time, I was living in Florida.
In Florida. Okay. So you're in Florida, you're emailing with the Foundling Hospital. Yes. When did you decide to go over to England?
Well, they sent me some little snippets and a little bit of a summary, but they said that if I wanted to see the files, I would need to come to London. And my husband and I were planning to take a trip to Barcelona. And I said, well, and I'm doing the logistics. And I said, well, why don't we just stop in London? Let's just do that. And as if it was on the way. And so we stopped, and it's really how the whole beginning of the journey unfolded, is that I would make these decisions that weren't really decisions, that it was just kind of this vague curiosity. And so then we went and we met with it's now called Quorum, is the institution named after the founder. And they said, don't expect much. We really never have anything much more than a confirmation that the child was there. Mm-hmm. And she walked out and had this thick file of documents. And so you can just imagine my surprise. And then we spent, and they said there was much more than I could possibly have read. And so they said they would make copies for us. And then we went right across the way to the Foundling Museum. And when I was wandering around the Foundling Museum, it's near the British Museum for anyone who has visited London. And yes, I know you've been to the Foundling Museum. It's a wonderful
Yeah, I did.
museum.
I went there to do research. So I'm reading your book and just, catapulted back. I remember going through letter after letter where, trying to find their children. It was just so tragic.
It is. So, and I stood there and I said, this is something having to do with this place explains everything. And so, soon I had every single book you could possibly imagine on the topic. And then it led me to more and to more. And then I just said, well, I'm just going to start to write. And I did. And it was pretty remarkable. I think within just a year and a half, I was already with HarperCollins. And with my wonderful agent who I adore.
Who is that?
Molly Glick at Creative Artist Agency.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about that for a minute, because I bet we have some aspiring writers. So I wondered, when you were talking about the research, first of all, how lucky, how serendipitous that they brought out so much, that you had all this material. Right. So my first question is, why was there so much material? Do you have any idea? Because most foundlings don't have that.
Right. Well, the reason that I discovered, and as I said, it was like these layers that just kept uncovering and uncovering, is that I discovered that not long after my grandmother had been forced to give up my mother to the Foundling Hospital, forced by the stigma and shame of illegitimacy, within a month, she started writing to see how her little girl was. She has to see her little girl. And there was letter after letter after letter, asking to see her little girl, how is her little girl, and then asking for her back. But the Foundling Hospital had really created this, it was a very patriarchal institution that thought that they were raising children the best. And so she, even on the eve of war, she begged to have her child back. And she was actually in a small community called Shropshire near the Welsh border that was not expected to get any bombing attacks during the war. And they still said, no, we're the ones who can keep her safe. And so, I held all these letters in my hands. And my mother was also a little bit precocious, so she did tend to get in a little bit of trouble, though all foundlings got in trouble even for the most minor of things.
Right. Yeah. I was just thinking that this was certainly true for the orphan trains, that the children were told, your past is not your past, your parents are not your parents, your life begins the minute you're chosen. And parents, even if they had simply let go in a moment of utter poverty or desperation, and a week later, or even coming to the train station and standing on the platform, they could not get their children back. I just read Emma Donohue's Pull of the Stars, and she describes the same thing in Ireland with those terrible convicts.
The Irish laundries.
Yeah, the Irish laundries. And that the babies were taken away, and they had no choice, and that they were not allowed to have them ever again. It's that philosophy was very pervasive in a whole lot of places.
And I have heard from children from the Irish laundries after the publication of my book. They have reached out and read it and said that the experiences, the intergenerational trauma that occurred because of this, and what they read in The Secret Life of Dorothy Soames resonated true for them as being descendants of those who were basically abused in the Irish laundries.
Right, of course. And actually, Justine, I was thinking too, when I watched The Queen's Gambit, I don't know if you've seen it. It's wonderful. So the scenes for her, where she's in a very similar place, I often thought about your book, actually.
Yes, I did too.
Right? And it was beautifully shown, that kind of life, how vulnerable you are, the forms of control that the authorities had. It was very interesting. So here's my second question related to the research. So you got this great pile of stuff, but I wondered then if maybe, because Julie was talking about you as a lawyer and how amazing it is that you've got on to sort of to write like this, but I wondered if your lawyerly abilities helped you at all in your tracking down all the stuff that you found.
Oh, absolutely. Because I was a public interest attorney, and so we would take on different cases, and I mean they would be quite large. Like we were working to defeat a coal-fired power plant, or a large landfill, or they were really usually up against pretty significant interests that were armed with. They had lots of a whole cadre of lawyers and paralegals, and so we didn't have the same resources, and so I'd have to go dig into the government files and unearth whatever it was. The wrongdoings that were happening. And I would also have to get up to speed on whatever topic our particular case was. For example, I had to learn how coal plants worked. I had to learn how a paper mill worked. And so you just got really accustomed to getting up to speed on subjects that you don't know, and how to do that quickly, efficiently, and how to gather all of that information. And so it definitely helped. Also helped me to be methodical in my approach.
One of the things I like about your book is that you actually have these bombshells that happen every now and then. Stuff really does change as the book progresses. And there are, moments of great suspense and surprise. And I wondered how you did that. Because you got all this material. I would imagine that at some point there were surprises. I'd love to hear about some of the surprises, but also that you had to craft a narrative out of a life. And we all know that a life is messy. It's not, it's not in this beautiful form of a novel, of a memoir. So how did you do? So first of all, how did you make sense of it? Were there big surprises that surprised you? And then how did you kind of shape those in the book?
Well, there were surprises. They were happening all the time. And I mean, I would be writing the book. I would actually be in the editing process, and I would come across another surprise, that I would unearth something. And I remember, I can't remember exactly which surprise it was, but when I was working with Molly, my agent, we were about to submit, and I unearthed something else, and we had to we had to edit it right before it was going out for submissions. And I was just as surprised at some of the things that happened as I think the reader is when they're.
Is it possible to share one of those that doesn't feel like too much of a spoiler? Just because I think it's fun for people to hear what kind of thing you might have unearthed as you were going.
I think it's impossible to talk about the book without any spoilers, but we'll leave the really big ones to, I'll make sure not to cover those. But one was that I can't remember exactly how I figured this out, but I figured out that my grandmother was alive when I was, and until I was 7 years old. And that was, I'd always, as a child, I'd never had grandparents. My father was an orphan and my mother a foundling, and so I had no grandparents. And I always craved a grandparent because my friends had grandparents. They'd give them little gifts and all of that. And I knew it was something special. And to discover that at my age, that there was a grandparent in my life was really, it was very emotional.
Sure.
So, and I didn't, one thing I will say, going back to the public interest attorney aspect of it, one thing that did allow me to do was to go into the book and into the research and be a little less emotional about it, because it's a very emotional topic. I'm not sure I'd have gotten through it if I knew how much emotion was going to be down the line. And so I was almost clinical in my approach in doing the research at the beginning. But in terms of structure, again, it became pretty clear that there were 4 stories. And I mean, at first, I was just going to tell the story of my mother. I was not going to talk about me. I was not going to, and of course, then I discover the story of my grandmother. And then when I'm doing the research to try to understand it and put it into context, I realized, well, there's another story. There's the story of these thousands of foundlings, and how this all traced back to, the 1700s, when illegitimate children were literally thrown in the streets, and left to die. And I realized, well, that's part of this story as well. And then I realized the other part of the story was I really didn't want to talk about myself. And I wasn't looking to write a memoir. But I realized that the story is that when you take a child and put them in institutional care, there are impacts, and the impact goes down generation to generation to generation. That the history of foundlings is not static. And when you make a decision there was a decision made in the 1700s to take illegitimate children and to put them in an institution and to raise them to be servants for Britain's ruling class. And that happened in the 1750s. And that decision impacted my family 300 years, a couple hundred years later. And I think that that's, an important part of it. And so having all of those pieces, I had to decide, am I going to go chronological or not? And then I decided that my mother's story would be chronological, and that we would weave in the history, and my story and
the psychology.
And the psychology and all of that. And so once I started doing that, I had to do some restructuring, but it became fairly obvious. I mean, there's a lot. When you read it, it doesn't seem like it would be obvious, but once you got all those pieces, it did.
Did you kind of write them separately and then piece it all together?
I didn't. I chose topics. Like, for example, there was a topic on medical care, and I thought to myself, and because the foundling hospitals had excellent medical care. I mean, they were brutal to the foundlings, and there were all sorts of problems, but all the foundlings got wonderful medical care. So I did the research on what doctors were like in the 1700s, and it was just fascinating. That's where they had one of the first clinical trials on inoculations. One of the in history was at the foundling hospital, because all the foundlings were, it was like a little petri dish. They all did the same thing every day. They ate the same thing, and it was a perfect place for medical experimentation. Of course, they weren't. No permissions were asked, but
right.
There were some of those problems. And the eradication of smallpox, you can trace back, some of the early work on that was at the foundling hospital. But then I thought about my mother and medical care, and that was actually some of the times when she was the most tender to me when I was sick. And then I remembered a story about when she, one of the few stories she told me as a child, when she was left in an infirmary. And so during a bombing raid of German bombers, and she was left all by herself when she was about 10, 11 years old, because she had the mumps or something like that. And they had this strict quarantine. And I remembered her, screaming in the middle of the night when air raid sirens went off. And so all these things, when you look back on how they dealt with medical care and quarantining when they had smallpox outbreaks and all of the care that was there, and you just flowed through my life and my mother's life, it all made perfect sense.
It really does. Talk for a moment about intergenerational trauma. I love that line, and you say something similar in the book about how, what decisions that were made 300 years ago affected your family, and you. And how did you see that play out?
Well, my mother, she was raised in such a brutal institution. And, I go a little bit into, like, for example, John Bowlby's attachment theory, and about how essential it is that a young child is able to bond with a caregiver. And by being able to bond with a caregiver gives that child the comfort and the security to be able to venture out into the world and to create attachments. And if you don't have that as a child, that you might have an attachment disorder. And so my mother, I believe, had an attachment disorder. And so even though I was raised in a house that was, on the outside looked like it should be, it was enviable. And in many ways, I was very fortunate that intergenerational trauma, it passed down to me.
In what form was your mother sort of depressed? Was she angry? What was it that all of the above?
There all of that, but and I do show instances in the book where my mother, she tossed aside she broke a coffee table and she threw my dollhouse across the room, and those are all not normal things. I understand that, but what I learned at the end of the day is that those weren't the things that really caused the dysfunction in our house. And I think that it's resonating, particularly some people have read the book, they say the light bulbs went off in their head, where it's not always, you can't point to something and say, oh, she hit me, or this happened, but that when you have intergenerational trauma, that there is just a feeling in the house that you can't put your finger on, that can cause, issues such that there was in our house. And in my case, by doing all this research, in a way, I was almost lucky that I could go back and I can trace back the trauma of my family back to a decision that was made in 1750, and trace it all the way back down. And so, for example, you might have, children of those who were in Japanese internment camps, and the Native Americans that were forced to go to boarding schools, and there's list and list, the orphan train. But there's a lot of people out there, I think, that they had trauma in their past, in their family's past, and perhaps they can't put their finger on it.
Yeah, I like that. I like that way of articulating it, because actually it is very hard to deal with, because there's no solution. It's like a black hole that exists that will never be filled. You can't make it better. Whatever you try, and some things will help, but it does feel like it's such a larger problem than a child, for instance, has any power to solve. So I think sort of learning that you aren't at fault and that there was nothing you can do is an important part of healing, don't you think?
I do. And I think that children of parents who've had trauma, when there's issues, children of parents who all sorts of things happen, tend to blame themselves. And so, but I was really struck when we had a conversation when we were at that writers conference, that you talked about how you had book tours after the orphan train, and that people would come up who were actually descendants of those who had been in the orphan train, and said that there was just difficulties in their.
Well, yeah. I think I may have told the class this anecdote, but I often met descendants of train riders, of course, and I've gotten, hundreds and hundreds of letters, and there are all these descendants, but there was one event that I did in California. A lot of people moved from the Midwest to California. And someone stood up who was a daughter of a train rider, because I was talking about exactly what you're talking about, intergenerational trauma. And I then asked, which I don't usually do, how many of you are descendants of train riders? And 4 people stood up, all children of so not even grandchildren. They were the children of train riders. And all 4 of them talked about how wounded the parent was, and how in some ways there was just something wrong that you couldn't fix. And it was this cloud over the family for all of them. In my novel, Vivian never has children, in part because of that, because she said, I never had a model for how to be a mother. No one ever showed me. I didn't know how to do it right. And a lot of these children of train riders carry that, what you're talking about, that real sense in childhood that they didn't know what was going on, but that something really terrible had happened, or that this person was very wounded.
I have been getting emails. People have been finding me all sorts of ways since the book has come out. And I have been getting, I told you about the Irish laundries. I've getting some people who were
Yes.
heads of the Irish laundries, but I've been getting emails from both foundlings and descendants of foundlings. And the foundlings have uniformly told me, which makes me feel so much better. They thanked me for writing it because they want the story to be told. And of course, that's my biggest fear was that, I wouldn't tell, I don't feel like it's my story, just my story. I mean, parts of it are, but I feel like it's a bigger historical story and I wanted to make sure I was telling it right. But then I would get email after email from descendants of foundlings saying exactly.
Right.
And it would just start out and they would say, I feel as if you were writing my family story. And then I would get another email saying, I feel like you were writing my family story, which just, it was remarkable.
Well, that's really the power of doing a book, right? And of getting it out in the world. And especially on a topic like this, where I don't think there have been many memoirs about children from the Foundling Hospital. Have you come across others that you might recommend to people who've read your book if they wanted to read something else?
Well, I think that was part of the reason that I was compelled to write a book is because I didn't. There is a lot out there written, and there's one from that's written actually by a male foundling about his experiences. And then there's there's a lot of fictionalized accounts. I mean, foundlings pop up in from Oliver Twist, and of course, and Charles Dickens lived around the corner, and my mother was named the same way that Oliver Twist was named. And so you see a lot of accounts, and then there's lots of historical.
Can you talk about that? What do you mean by that for people who haven't read Oliver Twist?
Oh, sure. So, well, Oliver Twist was named. He was an illegitimate child, and so he was renamed to protect his family. And in it, there's I remember it was like a choleric man named Mr. Swubble. And just chose names in alphabetical order, and so he got to the T's, and that's when Oliver was called Oliver Twist. And so
great.
And so Charles Dickens he lived around the corner from the Foundling Hospital and would wander the grounds, and he actually owned a pew in the church, which is a way that you supported institutions way back then, is you bought a pew. And that's where he got the inspiration. And there's a lot of, if you read Dickens, there's a lot of homages to the Foundling Hospital in there, not just in Oliver Twist, but in Tatty Coram, well-known characters named after the founder, Thomas Coram, and all sorts of things.
That's so fascinating. Yeah.
Yes.
That's great.
So,
I know we probably only have a few minutes left, and we have a question that I will ask you in a second. But I wanted to just go back so I don't forget to my question about you started to write, and then how did you find an agent, and how did that unfold for people who are interested in writing memoir? How did that unfold for you?
Certainly. Well, I approached writing like I would a case that I did. I would take on a case. It's unfamiliar territory in a lot of ways, and I would surround myself with people who well, the first thing I should step back a second. The first thing is I would treat it like a job. I actually decided to take a year off from work and work on the book. And I also decided that I was going to commit resources to it. It's like a business. I mean, you wouldn't open a business and then say, oh, well, I can't afford, a pizza business, and say, oh, I can't afford a pizza oven. Well, I'm not going to put money into it, so it's a business.
And so what did you put into it?
What I did is the first thing I did is I hired a book coach, someone that could help me navigate the industry, because it's an industry that I was completely unfamiliar with.
No, there was such a thing, actually. That's cool.
Well, the book coach is Ariel Eckstedt from the Book Doc.
Oh, of course. I love Ariel. Yeah.
So, and so she, so she helped me navigate the industry. And the other thing, when it came time to do the pitches, She helped me put together a list of who to pitch to. And then I made sure that my pitch was really good. And I made sure that my book, when it was time to submit, was perfect. And in fact, all the agents that read it said, this is so clean. There's no typos. I mean, one agent who, Jim Levine, said he was very proud of himself because he found a typo on the last page of my book that I had submitted to him. So, and I decided, and I did a pitch, and then I submitted the entire book instead of a proposal. Which there were several reasons for that. One is because the book is so, it wasn't playing out very well in the proposal because so many different things happened.
Oh, right. Yeah, it's hard to describe.
So, and I, as an unpublished author, I decided that it was best so that I could see that I could write.
Yes.
And so, I mean, it was really pretty astonishing. I mean, I was very calculated in who I submitted to. Like, for example, and I got introductions.
How did you even know what editors to submit to?
I had a book coach who helped me figure out who to do. So, but also I did things, for example, one of the few completely cold ones I did was to the agent of Martin Sixsmith, who wrote Philomena. And I submitted and I said, you represent Martin Sixsmith and Philomena, and I'm telling a similar story. And I sent that, and within 3 days, they made me an offer. I didn't end up working with them, but I was so calculated in who I'd, and I, worked to create a little bit of buzz, put them all out at the same time, then interviewed the various different people that came back in, and, then made my decision with Molly.
So you did a multiple submission.
I did.
And you, this was to get the agent.
Yes.
And this is for people out there who are, again, interested in doing this. One easy way to find the name of an agent is to look in the back of a book that's like yours or that you admire, and they always thank their agent. So you can find information there. Yeah.
Excellent idea. I did not do that.
Well, you didn't have to because you'd hired the book doctors.
Yes.
You hired Ariel. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And so then how did you decide which agent to go with? What were you looking for?
Well, the first thing I did is I interviewed them. And, I spent a significant amount of time just having a conversation with them. And I thought about, what did they think about the book? How passionate were they about the book? What were their suggestions? Because one thing I learned is that my book was never perfect. I can always take feedback. I craved feedback, even though I hate feedback. Feedback makes me just want to crawl in a hole, and I don't want anyone to think anything's wrong, but I sought feedback out at every single step of the way from people who knew what they were talking about. And
your lawyerly thing again, that you know the value of feedback and how it's going to help you ultimately.
Yes, absolutely. And then, I thought, I just ended up with Molly because, well, first of all, I knew that she was a very reputable agency. She loved the book. She had a vision. She had a way forward. She knew exactly how she was going to approach publishers. She already had people in mind. And I just really liked her a lot. And I could see us working together. And it's really important that you have that good relationship with your agent.
Yeah.
Because I've heard people say that they switch a lot of agents, and I'm like, oh, I just love Molly.
You're done.
I know. Molly's going to get all these submissions right after this.
No, that's great though. I think it's fun for people to hear sort of how that process works. So we have a couple of questions here. So let me ask you. So Carolyn Madsen asks, what have you found out about Eileen and Lena's lives after you published your book?
So, well, there are, let me see, I'm going to have to navigate this a little bit without telling spoilers. So I did get a lot of people reaching out to me, and I did receive a phone call one night, And the person called a couple of times, and then they ended up leaving a voicemail. And I listened to the voicemail and I said, oh, this is a foundling. I could tell, British accent, of course. And so I called her right back, and she said, I knew your mother. And
Wow.
and I'd met other foundlings that knew my mother, and she said, but I knew her in California. I knew her right before she died. And we ended up talking on the phone that night for, oh my gosh, an hour and a half, 2 hours. And she told me about how she would have these calls with my mother periodically, pretty often. And that they would talk about, just what their lives were like as adults after being a foundling. And, and she said, I could tell your mother was troubled and that she was really, struggling with her past. And I learned a little bit about how she'd come through Canada to get to the United States. I did find out a bit more, but I think it's just a little bit too much of a spoiler.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that actually leads me to a question, which is, what would you do next, or what are you doing next? Is it one and done, or are you, going to do this, write some more?
Well, I loved the experience of writing a book. There's moments when I didn't. Sometimes my husband would come home and I'd be wanting to pull my hair out. But I love being a writer. I actually had thought about writing a book about my adventures litigating in the rural South. And similar to this book, pulling in different themes in the past and how the past influences the present. So, for example, being a female litigator in the South can be challenging. I'm supposed to be fearless and fierce in taking on some really powerful interests, but I'm supposed to do it with a smile on my face, and I'm supposed to be sweet at the exact same time. And sometimes that doesn't really work. And I've already started a little bit of research on that, where, women couldn't even serve on juries in Georgia until the 50s. And so you can see how women were, treated in the profession, pretty recently. And so some of that starts to inform some of the experiences that I had today. So that is in the works.
Oh, that's great. So that will be, you think, your next book?
Yes. Now I've gotten so many stories about foundlings that's definitely going to show up somewhere as maybe just a long essay or something like that. Some of the stories that are just remarkable.
They are. I did an event with Heather Morris, who wrote The Tattooist of Auschwitz.
Oh, of course. Well, Sarah Nelson. That's
yeah.
Sarah Nelson.
And I remember her. I think didn't she do another book, or maybe she was talking about, where she collected stories? Just because she got so much from other people that were hard to believe, but right. True.
Exactly. What I found is that I was a little bit afraid to, as an American, particularly telling the story of foundlings in England, and I wanted to be true to their stories. And it's been very rewarding that all the feedback from foundlings has been, this was their story. But they're so grateful that story is being told, and they want their stories to be told. And part of it is because I think that as children in such an institution, they were really voiceless.
Right.
No one had a voice. And they, there's my mother went back to the Foundling Museum as an adult and for an event with former foundlings, and she literally thought that they were going to have the event in the basement. And instead they were ushered upstairs. If you go to the Foundling Museum, there's these beautiful rooms, the courtroom and the gallery room.
Right,
They were ushered upstairs, and she was just astonished.
I think there's a similar scene in Queen's Gambit. I love like that idea of going back and not being, and that weird feeling of not being, breaking rules, and you can walk anywhere, and it's pretty interesting. I also found with the orphan train story that generationally there was so much shame about it for those people, and so to be honored by their children and grandchildren, for them to see what had happened and to be proud of them for coming through it was another stage of sort of, reconciliation.
There's a reason it's called The Secret Life of Dorothy Soames, and that's because my mother kept it a secret for most of my life, and because of the shame that she felt.
You were really the one doing the work of reclaiming this for her. I mean, what a daughterly task you have had, and what a testament to, and it's a legacy for your family. It's really very, on a personal level, you've got this sort of international book, this story that will help other people, but on a personal level too, I would think it's quite satisfying.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So, of course, and this is one of the comments that I've gotten, and is how sad it is that this conversation and this research that I had done did not happen until after my mother passed away.
Yeah.
And, to me, that's part of the tragedy of it, is that I didn't feel I was in a place where I could do it when my mother was alive. And, so there's a lot of tragedy surrounded with institutions like this. And I'm actually working with, just about to do a blog post with an organization that works to stop Hope and Families. Is an international organization that works to stop institutions and orphanages worldwide. And I discovered that there are about this is astonishing, 3 billion children that are in institutions, and 80% of them actually have family that could care for them if they were provided the right resources.
Wow.
Which was just astonishing to me. I mean, England doesn't have it anymore. I mean, they learned from the founding hospital, the report that basically took down the founding hospital stopped institutional care for children in England. But it still goes on.
Well, that's terrible. I wanted to go back to a quick thing you said, which was that you weren't at a place in your life where you were ready to tell this story. But I also wonder if your mother would have been ready for you to tell it. I'm not sure, just based on who she was. And
right.
Do you think she would have let you write this memoir?
I am not sure. She wanted the story to be told. As I talk about in the book, she wrote up her story, and part of this story includes that. It was about 40 pages of her detailing a lot of things that happened. And so I really, truly believe that she wanted the story to be told. And that, she didn't know the publishing industry, and she didn't know how to get it published. I do think that if she had had the right support, that the book would have been written by her.
That's fascinating.
So,
okay, we have another question. Beyond individual families that spread out from Britain, did you find that the Foundling Hospital had a big influence in other parts of the world? Did it serve as a model?
I do know that there's a Foundling Hospital in New York, but it's not related. And I think that they were involved with the orphan train.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah.
Foundling. So
I am not aware of the Foundling Hospital having an impact in terms of, I think hold on just a second. Sorry about that. It blurred up. And so I have to turn off my video to get it to unblur.
Oh, right.
Technology. More of the influence of the Foundling Hospital that you can see is more cultural in terms of there's Dickens, the influence of Handel. You can trace back a lot of the governors who helped start the British Museum, the Natural History Museum. Solitary confinement can be traced back to the Foundling Hospital. I guess that's one way. It's not the Foundling Hospital itself, but some of the practices you can trace back to at least gaining popularity and influence back to the Foundling Hospital. If that answers the question.
That's good. That's good. I think maybe we have time for one more question. So I would like to ask you what you're reading, and if there are any memoirs or novels that are that if someone reads yours, they might read next or like I was thinking, as I told you, of The Pull of the Stars by Emma Donahue, which I just read, that has some resonance with yours. But what are you reading?
Okay, well, of course, The Exiles. And, I sent Christina this. So there's The Orphan Train and The Exiles, which of course I loved both. And the number of similarities.
Yeah, so many. I love your list, which we did get to. You have this one.
Okay, so in case you were wondering what lawyers do, lawyers write lists like that.
Well, it's all the things. So we've talked about this: intergenerational trauma, society's inability to care for its children, fallen women, class. I guess we talked about class. Renaming, we talked about that. Treatment as chattel, punishment, and how it was entertainment for we didn't talk about this stuff, but how it was entertainment for people, right?
So one of the characters, Mathena, they basically, there was that scene where she's entertainment for.
This is in The Exiles. This is
in The Exiles, yes. So Athena, who's an Aboriginal girl who's taken into this elite household, is entertaining them.
Yes.
And in the Foundling Hospital, the elite members of London, society would go and actually pay money to see the mothers give up their children and being distraught. And they would also go to the Foundling Hospital just to see the foundling sleep.
Like a real life soap opera or something.
Right.
Yeah, unbelievable.
Right. And so the number of the similarities were just, really.
Well, in The Exiles, there's a whole group of people in London that they called misery mongers who would go and hang out in front of Newgate Prison to try to see the prisoners being brought out to be taken to the ships. And then they would line the road by the docks to see the women marched off onto the boats. I mean, pretty fascinating. I mean, but you also have to remember public hangings, right? And kind of spectacles. I mean, these were, as I say, real life soap operas where people were looking for entertainment, and it was real life entertainment to other people's great distress.
Right. And I mean, and it's also a story that there weren't fallen women, and that the women didn't pay the consequences for unexpected pregnancy. Your book might not have had the plot that it had.
Exactly. It was definitely pivotally important.
Yes. And my family's journey would not have been the same.
Exactly. Well, Justine, it's been so lovely talking to you. It's 7:00, so I guess we need to close up. There's Patricia. Hi, Patricia. But it's been a pure pleasure, and I wish you the greatest of success that you've already achieved. You're already achieving with this book, this beautiful book. I was proud to blurb it, to write it back. Riveting, heartbreaking, and ultimately healing, among other things. So anyway, it's just wonderful. So yay.
Congratulations, Justine. As a person who loves history, it's a pleasure to see someone whose debut is a history, a well-researched and heartrending unearthing of a great story. So thank you so much for doing that and for being with us this evening. You and Christina, I think it's time to start a podcast.
I think we had a good time.
And a good time was had by all, and I appreciate it, as do our audience members who had so many wonderful things to say. And we're looking forward to, Justine, your next one. I don't know. I think you're onto something here. You're on a roll. So keep bringing it. Okay.
Okay.